John, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So you work for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which has been working since 1974 to build local power and fight corporate control of our livelihoods. And I wanted to get your reaction to the Democratic governor of Maine, Janet Mills, vetoing a bill that made it to her desk that would have authorized the takeover of Maine's two largest investor-owned utilities and replace them with a consumer-owned utility operated by an elected board. Have you followed that? Do you have thoughts on that?
I'm so glad you asked me about Maine. I actually just interviewed Seth Berry for an ILSR podcast. He's one of the lead representatives in Maine who was behind the legislation to create that public entity, that consumer-owned utility. The Pine Tree Power Company is what it would have been called. And the good news is that effort's not dead. They can still go to the ballot and get around the governor's veto. And I think what's really interesting about what Maine is suggesting to do is that they are not just saying, let's take this over as a public entity and run it as a monopoly, but they're saying, let's use the power of the public to take this utility out of private hands. And these are utilities which, by the way, have the worst national ranking on reliability. They are among the worst in customer satisfaction. And they also have some of the highest costs in the entire country. So these are terrible utility companies. These are exactly the ones that you want to be holding accountable. There are private utilities that are relatively well run, that have high customer satisfaction, that have low costs. Maybe we don't need to, maybe if they're working well, we don't need to do this. But to me, I just want to point out, this is a case of egregious behavior by a private company failing to act even in a very good customer service standpoint, if ignoring the broader public interest. So I think what Maine has gotten right about this is they said, let's create a utility that's a consumer-owned entity. So it's like a cooperative. Consumers will be owners of this utility company. It will be run by a nonprofit. So it's not going to be run by the government. It's going to be controlled by the government. It's going to be created by the government, but run by an independent nonprofit organization that will be represented by consumers. And the idea is really, because they're taking over the hardware, the wires of the system, is to run it a lot like we would other public goods and platforms. So, when we talk about in the national conversation about the problem with platform monopolies, whether it's Facebook or Amazon or Apple, we're talking about the fact that they control platforms in a way to restrict others' access to them. And what we have right now in the electricity system is this burgeoning availability of localized technology we can use to address climate and to lower costs. Smart thermostats, smart plugs that we can use for devices, rooftop solar, batteries, electric vehicles, and all of these things can be aggregated and networked together to meet the needs of a 21st century electricity system and do it in a low carbon and low cost way. And the problem is that the utilities, with their very old ways of thinking about how the electric system works, have often opposed this. And so what Maine is saying is, let's create a utility that actually opens the platform, that says, we're not just going to take over and have the public control this, but manage it in the same way. We're going to actually manage the grid completely differently. And we're going to look for those entrepreneurial ways that we can address system needs. So, for example, if you think about Texas and the problems that they had this winter during the freeze down there, there's a lot of different ways that a publicly owned entity could help address that problem. So you could go to third parties and you could contract for power from clean energy and from fossil fuels, but you can make sure that they've insulated their pipes, for example, so that they're going to be able to offer power in the winter if that kind of thing happens. And it being Maine, I'd expect that was already on the table, but you're ready to address that. Maybe you're ready to provide additional supply in times of drought. Climate change is changing how a lot of different places around the country are operating. Maine has a lot of hydropower that they rely on, but if there's an extended drought, then their electricity system is going to need more power supply. And so investing in things that would be more resilient and available during that time. And then allowing all of these kinds of competitive services to address, those times of peak demand when it is really hot in the summer, or maybe it's really cold. You've got a lot of folks using electric heating in the winter. What is it that makes your system more resilient? Well, you go out to the market and you say, here are the things that we need, not just how do we build it for ourselves and how do we tally up a big profit for our shareholders. So I think Maine has really identified a very forward-thinking approach that not only addresses a really horrible consumer-facing utility, private utility that's performed poorly, but offering a solution that really embraces all of the possibilities of a 21st century electricity system.
John, from your position, you get to look across all the balkanized energy markets in the country. Your Local Energy Rules podcast, you've interviewed people from all over the country working on these issues. You have this really great perspective. And one of the issues I've been wanting to talk with you about is this kind of transmission versus distribution system kind of conversation where it's like build it big and ship it in, or invest in the customers, 1 in 4 solar owners, batteries that shave peak, through demand response, this new FERC order that allows for distributed resources to provide grid services like voltage regulation and peak reduction, and even some of the economic studies that show that that would actually be the cheapest way to do it, is to invest in demand reduction and use private capital to invest in the distribution system. However, there is this one thorny little issue that we run into, which is how do we get information about the distribution system? How do we plan around it? And how do we kind of unleash this new investment paradigm? And I know you're dealing with that in Minnesota and other states. So maybe could you frame that up for us and talk to us about distribution system planning and transparency and why it's important, and what people are doing to open up this new market?
I sort of want to approach this from like two different ways at the same time. So I'm going to start with a sort of like boring business as usual way of understanding how distribution planning works, which is basically utilities. Every few years, they sort of forecast what's likely to happen, where's their population growth and whatnot. And they say, okay, well, this substation is going to need an upgrade, or these conductors, these power lines, they're going to need an upgrade in order to meet the needs of this community. And they put it into their capital plan. They put that in front of regulators, and they say, we're going to need $100 million over the next 5 to 10 years to plan for the way the distribution system is going to grow. I'll just start by saying even utilities themselves have had very little knowledge of what's going on in the distribution system. Just to give an example, when the first solar array was attached to a house out in Massachusetts in the 1970s, it's the way we found out how net metering would work, because when they plugged it in, the meter started going backwards, and everybody was kind of like, so I guess that's what happens. And then when they decided, how are we going to make this work from like a transaction standpoint with the utility, they're like, well, I guess we'll just charge you for the net. Like the meter runs forward when you use electricity, it runs backward when you giving us electricity, we'll just charge you for the net. We'll call it net metering. And that like there is a policy born out of the like inability of the utility to do anything more sophisticated, because that's what the meter could do. We're sort of, in a way, we're victims of the way that the market has been structured for the utilities. If you're a utility CEO, or even just when we were talking about union labor, like if you're a labor leader, you're acting in a very rational manner based on the structure of the incentives that are given to you in the market. For the utility right now, they make money when they build infrastructure. So making the case for building infrastructure, building new poles, wires, substations, whatever, is a great investment. It's a great payback for you. And so there's really no, like, the knowledge that you would get about the distribution system these days is probably knowledge that customers are doing things that reduce the need for you to build stuff. And so who wants to know that? If we know that, then the regulator is going to know that we don't need to build as much stuff, and we're not going to make as much profit. So the problem that we've really run into is that you start from the standpoint of the utility really has no interest in knowing what's going on at that level. And then beyond that, they have no interest in sharing what's going on in that level, because then competitors would have even more access to make the case that there are cheaper ways to do things than the way that utility is used to doing them. And all of those things would not make the utility money that those entrepreneurs and independent businesses would do. So we really have this structural problem. And I guess a great way to think about it would just be, we have this incredible network of transportation, and I mean road transportation. Obviously, we could have a lot more interesting transit stuff, and there's a whole other section of policy that can talk about that. But we have this interstate highway system and local road system that is completely publicly paid for and free for everybody to use. So whether it's Uber Eats or FedEx or UPS, like all sorts of stuff can take place on that network free of charge. Now just imagine if one of those companies, like Uber, all of a sudden owned all the roadways. They'd put up toll gates everywhere on it and charge everybody for access to it, especially the people who compete directly in their area of business. So Lyft would pay like a $10 fee for every ride. And when folks wanted to know like about traffic, Google Maps gives us traffic information about roads. Well, what if they couldn't get that? What if they couldn't tap into traffic cams? What if they couldn't get information from the Department of Transportation about when there was going to be construction anymore? Because that was all proprietary and it wasn't public. you start to think about how those problems would accumulate on what is now a public asset, and you look over at this private asset, the grid, and you realize, wow, it's probably at least that deep, if not deeper, the kinds of things that we could do if only we knew. And so, I mean, ultimately the solution is we got to break up the platform monopoly. I mean, we can't have people with private and perverse interests for profit controlling the very network that would allow us to bring all of these other services to the grid for so many reasons. I mean, one is obviously their incentives are all wrong. Two is they're very conservative. And so even if they recognize they wanted to change, they don't really do it very quickly. And three is even if they were really innovative and creative, the regulators are also very conservative. And so it's hard to make changes in a system in which there are these layers of bureaucracy between anybody making change, whether that's people on the outside trying to pressure the utility or people inside the utility trying to create change in a culture that is not about change. And so it's just broken from all of those different ways. And the way that we solve this ultimately is we got to do what people in Maine are saying we got to do, which is we got to take over the platform in a public way, and we got to run it in a non-discriminatory open way. And we just have to declare that data is open. And that we are going to bid for and pay for people to bring services onto this grid system based on that open and transparent access to data and based on what the fair prices are, and by a company, a nonprofit, a public entity, whatever, that has no profit interest in the particular means of doing it, but just in making sure that the system is reliable and low carbon and efficient.